Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the Oxford Martin School and to the second of this term's lecture series. We're very delighted to have today Professor Clionadh Raleigh from University of Sussex, where she is the Professor of Human Geography. Clionadh is a political geographer, and her work is focused mainly on conflict, governance, and the social consequences of climate change in sub-Saharan Africa. And she directs the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, tracking local conflict events in 50 countries. And she will today talk to us about climate violence. So, Clionadh.
Okay. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be speaking with you tonight, especially as Chelsea Clinton is having her book launch or announcing her political career, or whatever it is they're calling it these days, in the same town. So I'm going to talk to you about some research that I have been doing for about 12 years now. And it concerns the relationship between climate and conflict, but more broadly, what explains the manifestations of violence that we're seeing throughout the developing world, and in particular across African states. As Julian mentioned, I'm the director of Aggrieved, which is a project I started as a PhD student, and we track every week every reported act of political violence and protest that occurs across Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and we're about to expand into the Middle East for my sins. And what we're finding is that, I'm going to tell you the conclusion just in case the nice day calls you, is that there is very little evidence to suggest that the conflict and protest patterns that we see across developing countries is in any way correlated to climate change. That's not to say that there isn't often some sort of environmental link, but it's certainly not causal and definitely not determinative. Now, I plan to go through some of the reasons why the relationship has been confirmed in some quantitative work, and also what we're leaving out of the discussion when we focus on climate. And I hope you will have the patience to hear me out, and then we can have a robust discussion when we finish. Thanks. Okay, so my issue with the climate conflict debate, where it started and now where it started with a very, very clear question about whether or not there was going to be a direct relationship between increasing rates of climate change or disasters and a reaction of violence from the local level. And we found that there wasn't a clear relationship in very large and empirical studies. People then resorted to looking at smaller studies or smaller areas in order to confirm some of the mechanisms. And then in the recent years, we have regressed back to these much broader meta-studies to look at very, very general patterns to explain very, very local phenomena. It has not worked out particularly well for the clarity of this argument. And what I would say is that the presumed relationship that has been forwarded in the literature, and I think that many in the West pick up on, tends to depoliticize the conflicts that occur within developing countries. It acts as if conflict occurs for natural reasons. People will naturally become violent under conditions of adverse weather conditions, and nothing could be further from the truth. Cooperation is far more likely in difficult conditions, those that have been exacerbated by climate changes and those that are highly vulnerable to climate change. Far more likely. But cooperation doesn't make headline news, so we rarely hear about it. And instead, wars such as those in Syria are connected to climatic changes that have been going on for decades within those areas. And very key reasons for why these wars break out, 40 years of repression and autocracy, are often ignored, because the people doing the studies want to forward a climate argument, and they will do so regardless of the other very obvious reasons for a conflict to emerge. Okay, so in terms of the empirical research, of which much of this is based on, very, very high-level empirical research, we often see it on BBC News. It's, it makes the air for a few days, and then we all go back to writing furious letters to journals saying that there was problems with it, and all the rest of it. We're all familiar with that process. Many studies don't separate what is the environmental conditions and what are the climate conditions. And that's very important. There may be indirect relationships, certainly between how the climate affects water, land, territory, food markets, etc. But there is very rarely, if any, evidence of a direct relationship between climatic changes and what effects they have on water access. not even on land. Of course, the land issue is above and beyond most of what the climate issues try to deal with. But many suggest that land rights, water rights, food prices, and food marketing tend to be correlated to social instability, and in some cases they certainly are. But the climate link is indirect, if at all. Climate change may affect the economic health of a state, but the transmission and need for public goods, but this is only one stress of many on developing governments and how they manage to distribute public goods or how they manage to distribute rights to people on the ground who necessarily may need more land or may need less. But we prioritize this explanation in light of the fact that we have very, very specific conflict data, and that can be robustly correlated in some cases, although very rarely is it robustly correlated under robust conditions or rigorous conditions in models. Studies often use a one-time analysis to study a process that intensifies and changes over decades. A fight breaks out in an African village, and it must be due to scarcity. A riot breaks out in the capital, and it must be due to low availability and high prices of bread or food. What many studies of this relationship ignore is that communal skirmishes and urban riots are incredibly common in many of these cases. They're incredibly common and occur and have occurred for decades, in fact, far more than decades. They're a common feature, and we've only recently been able to have detailed information about the patterns, the processes, the agents, and the modalities of that violence. And that information, that atomic level information about events, does not appear to be correlated in any way to climactic changes that occur on the local level. So, that is to say, there's often aggregations of these conflicts that look as if it is land competition, rent competition, position or power competition, etc. So the empirical studies often have very specific climate indicators, but non-specific alternative explanations. And this is where I will bring in my conflict side more so than my climate conflict research side. Conflict is a competition for power. It's not about a vacuum of power. And it's not about grievances or scarcity. It's about competition. And competition in places that are deeply affected by climate change does not often involve the most vulnerable. It involves the people who have the most to lose from that. And what we find in those positions is that it is often reported as a grievance issue, but in truth, it is the people who have significant power in that region or significant power on the national level that are pursuing violence in order to leverage that for local power. So, the most likely explanations for conflict are not recorded in this systematic nature that temperature and rainfall are often recorded, and hence they're often ignored. There's a study recently that came out a few years ago and said that they couldn't include regime type or they couldn't include the type of political economy in a state because that would complicate the analysis, and they might be endogenous explanations. And so therefore it made total sense that the temperature, how hot it was, explained whether or not there was violence in a country in a particular year, and not the type of governance that people experienced, or the resources that were available to fund the government in that state, and how they were willing to go and get those resources and extract them. They treat political and social information that we know is important for violence as background noise. And instead, often physical scientists who pursue this relationship much more strongly than I think social scientists do can disregard the very, very important social and political phenomena that we know underlie violence. This prioritizes a climate effect rather than a social science lens, which of course would ask how climate fits into a wider system of pressures and incentives and disincentives for collective action within a social system. All of that tends to be missing from any of these analyses that focus on very, very simple, direct relationships. And the worrying part is the attraction of this work and the uptake of this work almost suggests that there's an intuitive truth to it. And that is, in fact, what's so dangerous about it. There is nothing intuitive about suggesting that the poor who live in very unstable or poor countries will attack their neighbor when it does or doesn't rain. There's nothing intuitive about it. At best, it's a very blatant form of environmental determinism. And at worst, it's a form of low expectations that is born of terrible attitudes and developmentalist attitudes towards the poor. And finally, the mechanisms employed to explain how rainfall or temperature influence the propensity to engage in conflict are outside of the reality of conflict in these contexts and these states, and the reality of politics in these states. As I mentioned, conflict is a competition for power, and its patterns, geography, occurrence, and modalities are closely tied to the issues and manifestations of power on the local level, national levels and international levels. It is not a reaction to grievances or blatant access to resources or the geography of the state or even exclusion. It is not initiated or fought by the poorest in society, who are often the most affected by climate change and will continue to be. It is initiated by those elites who seek to leverage and bargain through violence for more influence, positions, territory, and rents. So, just to summarize my argument against the broader climate literature, you cannot depoliticize the conflict that occurs in these contexts. We have to, in fact, engage with the fact that climate change and climate change adaptation and mitigation will have winners and losers. And if we already relegate those who are most vulnerable to be the most violent, then they have lost out doubly in this discussion. They are treated as a security concern as opposed to a humanitarian one. Okay, there's a few classic scenarios that we see kind of in this broader discussion that I would like to just go through and point by point try to dissemble. There's the raiders scenarios, which you may be familiar with, and that is that pastoralists who live, pastoralists or herders, or what they're sometimes called, will engage in lots of violent activity, and that's getting worse because they need to either go further or in fact they're expanding due to wealth, of course, because cows are how people keep their wealth. Now, this is both the raiders and the interlopers' explanation for violence. I have rarely seen these things tested in a climate conflict. I've seen them suggested constantly to try and justify some of the explanations that people find in empirical results. Before I am accused of being an anti-empiricist, I do empirical work myself. I just don't think that a general pattern over the entire world can tell us something about a village in Nigeria. So typical interpretations of this climate conflict paint an idealized picture where herders and farmers are battling for access to territory, and that can be heightened by drought or high temperatures or food price. And faced with an identity-based, zero-sum game, violence erupts to gain access to grazing land, water holes, etc. And what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with this picture is that people often have multiple livelihoods. So pastoralists these days are not often true pastoralists. They farm, they have cows, they do a lot of things. They go to the city to work during the dry season. They have a lot of different work. And in fact, what we often find is that states, in their attempt to make sure that pastoralists don't go anywhere and an attempt to tax people, can be very, very limiting in exactly how livelihoods are practiced. So this idealized picture is rarely truthful. Access to watering holes, to grazing lands, to land is negotiated over the long time through social organizations and social contracts. I'm sure any anthropologist can speak for quite a long time about the social contracts that mediate access to common use, or even public good use or club good use. And again, cooperation in these areas that are experiencing difficult periods is a far more likely outcome. And in fact, there's many organizations called the DEDZA in Kenya and other organizations in different countries that coordinate on the very local level who has access, for how long, and how that is going to be worked out in the community. All of these institutions exist. There is collective action to make sure that there isn't violence. And that gets ignored in this discussion. So that said, raiding amongst primarily pastoral communities is common as a source of wealth accumulation. And it's the implication that this raiding behavior increases during times of scarcity is nonsense. And I'm sure anybody here who's ever been on a farm might know this. You don't try and steal cows, not that you were stealing cows, but you don't try and steal cows before a dry season. That would be a disaster. Then you're stuck with cows that you can't feed. When we see a height of raiding behavior, it's right before the rainy season, when they can be self-sustaining and then they can be sold to market. It's not about the resource, it's about the wealth that comes with that resource. And the logic that people have about that is very similar to the logic you and I might have about wealth accumulation. So in drought periods, of course, you see many, many animals are sold into markets, driving prices down and lessening an already small asset base by pastoralists. But none of these mechanisms suggest that conflict is in any way beneficial to communities involved. Outside of the presumption that the climate or the heat, which is recently suggested, triggers violence, there's no basis to assume that climate changes change the calculus that underlies where violence occurs. We know in pastoral communities violence occurs right before the rainy season and during the rainy season. And we can see that over many, many years. We can see that in many countries simultaneously. We can see the height of violence and in specific raiding communities. We can see it move as the rainy season is a month early, 3 weeks late. It's a very, very, very close connection between those things. So the environment is affecting the strategy of these groups. It is not causing that violence. Another scenario is the interlopers. And this, of course, suggests that migration from grazing lands into farming areas causes tension. It does. Of course, it has for millennia, which is why there's local solutions to that. There are cattle corridors, like in Uganda. There's coordinated access, migration paths, community leader meetings that are now very well funded by the donor community in many of these countries. But the reason that you often find some tension between land use is that farmers are also extending the areas in which they farm for a number of other reasons, which is the political economy of these zones, to plant cash crops for markets, to provide for the taxes from the state, now being collected from settled areas, for large plantations to move in, such as those that have recently moved in to Malawi, and multiple cases of politicians owning both farms and cattle who allow the police to support any violent group that is protecting their asset. In other cases, militia groups who practice particular livelihoods have all of their actions explained by climate change when in fact, again, they are very typical manifestations of how the political economy of these local areas work. Okay? We can consider the Fulani, which I think I have a map of here. I know I'm not supposed to move away from that microphone, but I might. So this is where Boko Haram is active, and this is where the Fulani are active. Fulani was the third most violent group in Africa in 2014 and 2015. This group, as you can see, it engages mostly in violence against civilians. It's a pastoralist group, and some of its actions have been attributed to climate change in the region, which ignores the fact that the Nigerian government has largely cleared out of this region in order to reorientate its forces towards the north and towards the south. It wants to stop the war, and it wants to protect its resources, and it doesn't quite care very much what happens in the Middle Belt. And what we saw was that in a competition as to who was going to provide security for particular communities in the Middle Belt, the Fulani have enacted what is now a several years long war against smaller communities there. It was not a climate change issue. It was a power issue and a security issue. And it was reflecting the variety of conflicts in the region and how different groups are trying to leverage and take advantage of those. Okay. Now, the aggrieved rebels scenario is really the classic climate conflict argument, and that basically states that grievances will amount with land and water, and that would lead to significant threats to central regimes. If you remember a few years ago, and even now, climate change is regarded as a threat multiplier, and weak states or fragile states were believed to be in great danger of being overthrown because of it. This has not occurred in any significant way. Rebel leaders and movements are not inspired by the banal and daily grievances of people. I'm sure we all know that. They are just as violent towards their supporters as the government are towards its supporters or even its opponents. And attempts to connect, as I mentioned before, the Syrian war, Darfur, Mali, South Sudan, and others to climate causes have been widely rebuked by experts of those regions and of conflict. These connections are pursued, again, almost solely with those interested in the minutiae of climate and not people who know anything about the political context of violence within these states. And while these people may have a deep knowledge of environmental trends, I'm going to suggest they don't have a deep knowledge of the politics that lead to violence, intricate types of violence, or the 150 different militia groups that have emerged within Libya, or the 1,000 that have emerged within Syria, are not doing it because it didn't rain 10 years ago. That's not why they're fighting. We know that there's a temporal connection between high climate vulnerability, which is actually in almost all developing states, poor regime quality, poverty, factionalized societies, resource dependence, and conflict and instability. These qualities co-occur without causing each other in all cases. We know that subnationally and even nationally, those spaces that are most climate vulnerable are not violent. Malawi is the most climate vulnerable country in Africa. It has experienced atrocious floods several times in the last 10 years. And the region that had experienced them, in a region called Nsanje, didn't have one protest, not one call for the central government to be overthrown. Instead, a massive relocation plan moved a lot of people out of the region of Nsanje and moved in sugar plantations where the government could easily gain quite a lot of money from. What's happening in places like Bangladesh, of course, which we hear about a lot because of the issue of potential climate migration, is that perpetual issues with internal and external migration is not treated with any seriousness by the central government, who is fraught with internal battling and using militias to fight opponent parties in the street during by-elections. Serious concerns about land and land use are largely ignored by the government and lead to very localized skirmishes. There's been, in fact, an increase in Bangladeshi land skirmishes in the north just this last month. In short, when faced with environmental pressures, the governments of unstable, often developing countries rarely, if ever, respond with anything that will actually mitigate either the environmental or the political issues that are being experienced. The reason is a typical result of two facts, which often go undertreated, let's say, in this discussion. Governments don't actually care very much to resolve what might be seen as the petty local issues or step on the toes of local officials or authorities who might gain from any solution. And two, the issues over land or water holes, etc., they are not a concern to central governments because those who are most likely to be affected by them are the poor. And the poor, who are most at risk of climate change, are the least likely to challenge the government. They're the least likely to mount any significant campaign to do anything about their government because they don't often have the collective ability to do so. Or there are significant barriers placed in the way for them to do so. But the government is not neutral in how it approaches development, security, and the responses that they might have to environmental challenges. It has other concerns in which land, local authority, tax potential, bargaining for allies, and consolidated ranks are far more pressing and perpetual issues. So the ideology and grievances that we sometimes ascribe to rebels or that we ascribe to violent groups in the hope that, in fact, that they're using this for the betterment of their communities really doesn't make a lot of sense when we look at their patterns of behavior. And resources, which of course do play a significant role in violence to fund it, not to start it, but to fund it, are still a very important issue, but again, they're not causal. But we can't fool ourselves. These conflicts are about competitions, and whether it rains or not, or whether it's hot or not, can influence very short-term strategies, but it does not influence why that violence occurred. So consider South Sudan. For those who may or may not know, the dry season is just about to end in South Sudan, and so what we saw in the very recent past, let me just get that one up. What we saw in April of this year is the highest level of violence in South Sudan in the past 3 years. And the reason is that it's just about to be the rainy season. The government and the opposition is at each other's throats, and they need to get the positions they want to keep for the rainy season, in which they cannot fight, for the duration of that season. There is a massive attempt to claim territory in the late months of the dry season, because almost all conflict between the two main armies will cease from May until after September. And then it will restart again, as it has done in South Sudan for several years now, okay? That's not to say all violence will end. Local level violence is actually still quite high, and now assumes a large proportion of the violence. Let me show you that. The dark is government actions and government versus militias. The lighter blue is the SPLA versus the SPLA-IO. The orange is rebels versus militia and militia activity, of which there are many. And the gray is external actions. The point being is that these patterns of behavior, even though the politics of the South Sudanese conflict is very complicated, they follow a very clear environmental strategy when it comes to the amount of fighting that happens and how many locations are active at any particular time. That is not a climate signal. That is an environmental signal. It's an environmental strategy. And those two things are not the same. So the final kind of typical or classic case is that focused on urban level discontent. So the rural conflicts, of course, especially as they draw to be a slightly smaller amount than they typically were, a lot of conflict in African states, especially and also in South and Southeast Asian states, is occurring in urban areas. And the implication, of course, is that climate change is pushing people to migrate. They migrate into urban areas, and there you get kind of a perfect storm of grievance, population density, collective action potential, and also a very, very kind of distant state, if you will, despite the fact that it's right there. And we are, in fact, seeing a high rate of urban violence. There's no question about that. But what is questionable is whether this rate of high violence is correlated to the grievances that we see occurring, again, slums, food price, etc. And what we often see is protests increasing in these regions in response to that. But to be very honest, the government tends to generally ignore the concerns of urban citizens, and that is in part due to democratization in their rural base, and I'm more than happy to get into that in greater detail should you want to. But the urban areas are some of the most interesting cauldrons of where these tensions intersect. And of course, whether or not you can climate-proof these cities that are emerging in developing states. But in general, at the moment, I will say that yes, there is an urbanization of conflict, but it does not appear to be exacerbated by disasters or climate change. It appears to be exacerbated by the very difficult conditions of living in an urban developing country, an urban area in a developing country. Okay, so how does this reality kind of fit together? How can we understand the different pressures and tensions of the state in light of the fact that many of these countries are extremely climate vulnerable? The first thing we need to realize, of course, again, I want to reiterate, is that multiple conflicts occur within these countries. In India, Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, and Nigeria, you don't have one conflict being caused by one thing. You often have several conflicts occurring concurrently, but having very low rates of spatial overlap, which indicates that there's something different in different areas that's stimulating this violence. They're not going to be treated by the same thing, and they're not caused by the same thing. This is a recent map of political violence and protest by location in South and Southeast Asia from January to December 2016. As you can see, riots and protests are extremely common within the subcontinent. And what we can take from that is that there are, at this point, hundreds of issues giving rise to protests within the Indian state. Just like in Nigeria, there's in fact 3 very distinct conflict environments that have emerged within Nigeria that have very little to do with each other. And in Bangladesh, as I mentioned, you have rural issues, especially over land and sometimes over migration, and you have urban issues, and that's often the contest between political parties. And if we understand these things as distinct, we can make much more sense of where we believe that there's going to be climate pressure or environmental pressure or political pressure really pushing these things to emerge. There are many places affected by food price volatility, and again, such places, including, of course, across India, are areas of high protest and riots. But there is little or no short-term actions to quell recurrent food price disparities. In fact, Egypt is really a key case of where they've done massive efforts to deal with bread price. Often, and in Egypt, in fact, it's a really good example, often in Tunisia, and of course we saw this across North Africa, there's a government reaction when a significantly large political group is going to be negatively affected by something like food price or by something like land tenure. that is the only real stimulus. If their power is threatened in any way, will they actually do something to deal with what is an indirect or perhaps not even related to the climate issue? And these are land disputes by event type in 2015. I can come back to that in a second. So, as you know, many crises, especially in developing countries, are automatically associated with a climate link. So this is a short-term food crisis map by FuseNet and with ACLA data in blue, and it was for the first 3 months of this year. And the areas that were considered the most stressed in what is effectively a very underreported but serious food issue across African states at the moment, the most affected states are Nigeria, South Sudan, and actually parts of Zimbabwe. Now, there are very different reasons why those places are the most affected regions. Boko Haram is the reason in the north. There has been effectively a breakdown of the food supply system. The ongoing war in South Sudan, it's very brutal. That has affected, of course, whether or not there's likely to be a continued famine in South Sudan. And in Zimbabwe, it was something called command agriculture. Command agriculture was a way that ZANU-PF is hoping to raise money for the election. And so it changed the parameters of how to sell grain through a grain market, which you all might remember from the 80s as a terrible idea about how to distribute grain and how to sell it and buy it. And that has had detrimental effects during an economic crisis in the same country. In Sudan, of course, in Somalia, what we're seeing is emergency conditions, but what's interesting is they actually are not completely overlapping with the conflict areas. So what we see here in Africa is that, yes, in some cases, there's certainly issues that have been exacerbated by climate. Those areas don't see a lot of conflict. There are areas in which the food issues and the potential famines are directly related to climate as a result of that, not as a precursor to it. And then other areas, which is far more common, I think, where just sheer mismanagement has created a food price issue or a potential food crisis. Now, I'm going to stop in a second, but I did want to, I'll leave that one up. I did want to emphasize just a few things at the end here, which is that adaptation and mitigation are true ways forward in how to deal with the vulnerability that the poor experience within African states. I think there's a recent estimate that $25 billion have been put into adaptation across developing states. It's a huge amount of money. And this money is not necessarily distributed to the most vulnerable. I don't think anybody's surprised by that. But often the climate change and conflict relationship studies ignore the fact that massive amounts of money are going in to both create good adaptation practices, but also they create rents where there's climate change winners and there's climate change losers. And we've seen from case studies in Malawi and elsewhere that the areas that are most likely to get climate change adaptation funds are the areas that plant cash crops. Because the government knows, and makes a very rational decision. You could give money to Nsanje in the south, which has never produced cash crops and is decades away from that ability based on the people who live there, or you can send it to the north, where there are established farms that need help with irrigation and markets and infrastructure. They're making a calculation based on their economic reality, not necessarily the vulnerability to climate change. So again, people are reinforcing their own vulnerability to climate change through these practices, which are necessary, of course. But I want people to be cautious of suggesting that the link between climate change and the poor and the vulnerable in developing states is a security issue, because again, it is not a security issue. There is really very little evidence to suggest that the poor and those drastically affected by climate change have ever engaged in violence to redress that vulnerability. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that massive amount of aid money, or land tenure, water rights, are being used by people who are in already powerful position to reinforce that power. And I don't want us to be fooled into considering this a military issue when it certainly needs to be a humanitarian one. And that's it. Would anybody like to ask a question?
I do agree with you about environmental determinism being wrong. And I think that as a position one can agree with, that conflicts are not only related to environmental issues, they are ethnic issues, linguistic conflicts, religious conflicts, and I think you're right on that. But I thought you did mention that climate change may not be the contributor to conflicts the way it is claimed by those who kind of seek a monocausal link between climate change and conflict. But environment is. And I think that's kind of more moderate. I mean, when I saw the abstract of your talk, I thought it's someone who's a denier.
God, no.
No. And so your position actually is more acceptable, that climate change may not be the cause of violence in a way it's claimed, but environmental changes do have an impact in the way it leads to conflict over resources, it leads to dislocation of life, and environmental conflicts are not merely about conflict about resources. When people are dislocated from their livelihood, from their habitat, it creates a social, cultural, spiritual emptiness,
Sure.
and which leads to conflict. I come from India. I teach here in economics, but I come from India. I've studied conflict in Punjab, which is a green revolution area. And I've found that it's a developed region, agriculturally developed region. But mainly because of its development, the violence has taken place. People's daily lives have been completely shattered by the penetration of capitalism, the way commodity production has taken place. So that's so kind of, I agree with that. The second point which you mentioned about that those who argue that climate change is linked with violence seem to suggest that these conflicts are naturally violent. It's nothing to social. Now, if one constructs climate change not as a natural change, climate change is not natural. Climate change is implicated with socioeconomic changes, and I would introduce capitalism into that. That the global capitalism, the way it's operating, the system of production, consumption, exchange, or lifestyle, that has contributed to. So if climate change is taking place, it's not a natural change. And climate change is actually socially, culturally, politically, economically, basically these two comments.
I think that's great. I mean, I do follow quite closely the arguments supported or promoted by the political ecology reading, which I think are they're excellent kind of manifestations of the complexities that make up both rural and now urban livelihoods. And I would agree with you wholeheartedly that we can't at all disregard the environment. I just don't think it should be given the primacy that I think it is being given. I mean, I used to say, well, climate is the cause du jour, and then it became Islam. And we don't know what's next. No one is spending, I think, enough time, as you say, kind of detailing the experience of whether it is environmental change or social change or the composition of the population around you and what that's having on collective action and then the ability to engage in violence.
Actually, to follow up the question before, I would say to set up environmental determinism as a primary methodological or philosophical explanation is a bit bogus, because that was kicked out in the 19th century.
I've seen plenty of it recently.
Well, yes, but logically it can't happen. Higher temperatures can't cause that. I think the point you were making is about that the contextual interpenetration of environment and climate is really important, and that the causal, if you want to say causal, I would say that everything is related to everything else, could be secondary, tertiary, quaternary, and to look at that is quite complicated, because anything in our human world is generally mediated through us politically, economically, socially, and all the rest of it. So these are methodological points, there are criticisms. The other thing is you've picked out violence. Well, violence is only the top of the hierarchy of conflict. If you have a conflict model of society, there could be lots of non-violent oppositions, frictions, disturbances, whatever you want to call them. And I would be careful in just truncating the argument at violence, because violence is observable, and therefore you have an empiricist biased almost.
Okay, well, let me just note about environmental determinism. As I mentioned before, the people who typically study climate conflict, we are a relatively small community. And I think it began as conflict scholars looking into potential new trajectories or changes in violence patterns as a result of environmental change. And in the very, very recent years, natural scientists have picked up on this discussion, and I would go so far as to say their arguments are out and out environmental determinism. Temperature goes up, violence goes up. I mean, it's horrific, especially to imply that about people who are leading very, very difficult lives, and then to imply that they're somehow naturally violent is appalling. And yet, this is the very literature that is getting far more attention than the ones about the types of tensions that may emerge when new livelihoods have to be started, or there's new boundaries, social, economic, political, environmental, that emerge within your social sphere. I agree with you totally. But my concern is that this argument and the policy manifestations of this argument are quite wide and profound. And it is a ridiculous argument. I totally agree with you. But we have to challenge the tenets of it in order to make sure that it doesn't go forward. This notion about threat multiplication, or the fact that the US sees the climate conflict narrative as one of the most important lenses to view African violence. I mean, these are very, very serious things to consider. And they, I think, will have long-term effects on these regions and their abilities to adapt and to mitigate. They're treated like a security issue.
Great, thank you very much. Really fascinating talk and discussion. My name is Helen Jeans. I work for Oxfam on climate change adaptation. And so really found your reflections very helpful. I think Oxfam's been saying for a long time that climate change needs to be seen as a much more political phenomenon than it is. And I know that there is a conversation happening around the next IPC assessment report to actually really open up the science and not have so much of this kind of very simple climate science, which is only looking at impacts in this kind of, is it hot, is it raining, is it, etc., as you've characterized it, and really wanting to have a much more complex kind of social analysis, political economy analysis, to really get underneath and really understand the impacts of climate change in this much more nuanced way. But it's a real struggle. And I just wondered if you had some insights and reflections as a researcher who's working in this space that might help us to see how we can open up this space. You're clearly indicating that we need to have a much more complicated and intelligent conversation about climate change impacts.
Thank you. That is an interesting question. I typically don't study climate change adaptation, if only to think that the amount of money that has gone into states and where it's been distributed, or where it's been known to be distributed, has had sometimes quite mitigating effects on any tensions that it might emerge, especially within communities that have not received any development funding. So my husband works for IIED on adaptation, so I usually leave that to him. But so, what's strange, and especially in African states, is that climate change is not a huge policy issue, if I'll put it that way. I mean, you don't, in elections, you don't find it discussed. There's no programmatic change that's suggested. They're not trying to win people over with their perspective on climate change. And that worries me, in part because I think it's often treated, in some countries, not all, but in some countries, as a problem that external people will correct, or it's their fault and then it's their responsibility to correct it. And then I think quite extractive resource and farming and agricultural patterns and policies are enacted, and it's causing quite a lot of grief, I can only say, I suppose, on the very local level. I just got back from Zimbabwe, and as I mentioned, command agriculture has really had a terrible effect on the ability of farmers to sell their crops and to get what they need to in order to continue farming. And the response of the government is to now start command mining, because they don't only need money for the election, of course, they're going to need money for the succession battle. And that would go against all policies, all recommendations that anybody could offer about how Zimbabwe, which should have absolutely no issue with producing not only enough food to supply itself, but of course food to supply the region in general, should be engaging in. But already, and this is a really classic case, I think, there's a lot of partisan food outputs. So ZANU-PF, the regime, will give you food as long as they know that you're a ZANU-PF member in very, very difficult areas of food crisis. Even though it was the rain last year was fantastic, there's a food crisis in Zimbabwe. It's insane. And that is because of mismanagement. And I don't necessarily think that central government policies are going to be the solution, especially for a conflict, but I do think that it's a very important step for adaptation policies to adopt an adaptation plan for the state.
Hello, Brendan Bromwich, King's College London. Just to come back to Darfur, which you mentioned, the cause célèbre of climate conflicts. And I agree very much with the problem that you set up of people trying to drive investment and funding on the basis of selling it in that way. And you saw the huge program that UNEP ran there, on that basis. But so I worked in Darfur for 9 years, and we all realised that people only understand Darfur only looks clear from afar. And people either on one side of the argument or the other set up a straw man and knock it down and prove that as their point.
Right.
And with respect, I think you might have done that a little bit with your model of pastoral conflict, in terms of it being about cattle raiding. So again, in Darfur, this would be the time of year which we would expect to see violence at that level, but it certainly wouldn't be cattle raiding.
Of course.
It would be because the herders have come off the rangelands and are now in the same location. So it's more about control of land. But the difficulty there is now we've dismissed this issue of land and movement of cattle, and we came back, and I noticed your model of Darfur was the rebellion one, whereas actually I would suggest there are two wars in Darfur. One is the rebels against the government, and the other is a chronic conflict, which is often portrayed in very rationalist terms, and this is where the problem comes, in rational actor terms, of this conflict over natural resources and scarcity.
Right.
But actually what happens is when that is dismissed, it is dismissed in depoliticized terms, and you can see this from writers such as Selby and Verhoeven and Zaitun and Miramachi. All of these guys will put it forward as a ridiculous concept that these people are fighting over dwindling resources. But they have put forward a depoliticized narrative and then dismissed it. Whereas actually, if you put it in the context of the end of the Four Sultanate and the fact that the Arab tribes have never gained the power that the Four had, and therefore you can see the contradiction of Darfur being made 5 states and 1 region simultaneously, then you can realize actually there's highly politicized local conflict, which is routinely dismissed because it sounds too much like a climate narrative. So I don't think those local political dynamics of natural resource conflict have been given enough credence. And for all this, I'm not at any stage suggesting climate is the culprit for Darfur. Although, sorry, just to come to a close, I would support Ban Ki-moon's second op-ed in July 2007, where he said that we need to engage the tribal conflicts as well. And very interestingly, he was dismissed by the Save Darfur coalition, who wanted only to look at the conflict. They wanted to hold the government of Sudan to account.
Right.
Whereas actually in Darfur, it was very clear that that conflict was on the wane and the tribal conflict was coming up. So although Ban Ki-moon's comments were clumsy and his title was ridiculous, the climate conflict one, he actually was making an important point about addressing the local politics.
Brendan, we met in Addis in maybe about 10 years ago, I think, at a discussion about this very conflict. The reason I did give kind of a very quick gloss over the pastoral region, and it's because I wanted to save this audience from my very long thoughts on pastoralism. But I would completely agree. If you look at the Darfur conflict from 2004 to now, if you looked at it by week, by month, and who the main actors are, it has now resumed the level of intensity it had in 2004, 2005. But in the interim period, there's been a lot of conflict from communal groups. And of course, I'm not for a second suggesting that local conflict isn't about the distribution of local resources. I think it is. In fact, I think that's both a political and an environmental reason that explains some of the manifestations of violence. But what I disagree with is this notion that there is increased rating when it's hot, or decreased rating when it's hot, or increased in some models, or that anything but rainfall, which I know, in fact, influences rating behavior quite considerably, but there's many other issues, which is that who gets to live on that land and who's considered a citizen. We saw this issue in Côte d'Ivoire very clearly, and we're seeing it, in fact, across West Africa. I don't want to dismiss in any way how certainly people who are largely dependent on the environment for their livelihoods, that isn't a deeply held political issue for them. What I'm saying is that they're not reacting to the climate. And that is an issue, or that is an argument being put forth, not just about Darfur, but about Syria and others, which I think is very dangerous.
Thanks. I thought it was really interesting, but I'm a bit confused by what you mean by climate. To me, climate change is something that happens on decades. Mm-hmm. Now, you don't have data over decades, you have data over a few years. So what you've talked about is a connection between environment and conflict, but the environment will change over timescales of decades, which you don't have that connection made.
I'm not using those data here, but there's several papers where I've looked at decadal transformations with climatologists on the type of environmental changes that are happening in regions. And I think what's more important here is that people are using very, very simplistic temperature and rainfall aberration data in their models for violence. And yes, of course, the climate is a complex thing. It's not just physical, and it's certainly not just something that would happen over, this is weather effectively, and not necessarily climate. And we may not know, and I think certainly at that point, this argument might be moot, we may not, in fact, know the manifestations of what climate change is for any of us, developed or developing. And so what I worry about is you're right, what is even a more simplistic argument? How do people react to the weather? But given that I'm not a climatologist, I am not going to comment on widespread, let's say, century-long changes.
But you deny the connection between climate change and conflict.
I do. I don't think that something that is happening over 100 years made somebody go after their neighbor.
But you do accept that environmental issues have a connection to conflict.
And I want to be clear here. I don't think that the weather does. I do think that land does, or water access does, because I know that from my own research that people living in an area in which their livelihoods depend on both land access and water, which are not climate or weather issues, are going to have significant disagreements and tensions over that relationship. What my concern is that all environmental issues are now being kind of clouded into this, or grouped into this notion that it's somehow climactic, or it's changing, or there's something about it that is changing from outside rather than the internal use patterns or the internal kind of social institutions that are made to use it.
Can we ask one more question?
I think.
Hello, my name is David Carpenter from Oxford. As you're aware, there are large numbers of political groupings and institutions that are very keen on increasing the importance of climate change as in the public view. And there are a lot of political capital tied up in that. And in the light of that, I wondered whether your more holistic analysis of what's causing these conflicts is causing you yourself to find yourself in conflict with people, whether you're finding a great deal of opposition to this, this way of understanding conflict?
That's a good question. It's hard to determine what exactly seems to be annoying people. I mean, this part of my research or others. So, that is a difficult question. I do think that there's a cottage industry that has emerged to promote this relationship and others very similar to it. And those people and institutions and industries will find evidence or will kind of, I hesitate to use the word manipulate, but they will provide evidence as they see fit. I mean, there's plenty of evidence that many of these presumed relationships are nonsense, and yet they are routinely used either by military or by development organizations or by governments. I mean, again, to come back to Mugabe, I think he blamed the very severe food crisis in 2007 on climate change instead of his land redistribution policies. So one of the ways in which I hope to influence the discussion is to ask people to be aware of who's benefiting from the use of this narrative, rather than concentrating on what I think is very, very flimsy evidence for this narrative. And I mean, as I'm sure you know, sometimes they'll be receptive to it and there's some that won't. But it does worry me quite a bit about how quickly it caught on as the way in which, or as the main lens that people wanted to understand violence. I thought it was very disturbing, and I especially think the narrative about Syria is quite disturbing. Yes.
I'm a bit worried. I may have misunderstood you about the policy implications of your research, because I hope if I'm wrong, you can correct me. I thought that your emphasis in terms of policy implications on mitigation, is on adaptation rather than on mitigation. Mm-hmm. Now, this is an important difference, mm-hmm. because if you de-emphasize mitigation and emphasize more on adaptation, you're actually de-emphasizing also the importance of climate change. Because if you think that what we need to do is basically do things which will happen as a result of climate change, but we don't need to deal with the causes of climate change. Mm-hmm. That's one worry I have. And in the global debate, in the context of Trump coming into power and a climate change denier, this is quite a risky road to take. That's why I fear that there's a climate change denier, which you are not probably. That's one point. Second, I think the point which was made earlier very well, that it's one thing to talk about conflict, another thing which is linked, but another thing to talk about violence. That there are conflicts which are related with environmental conflicts, land, water, sources, forests, and so on and so forth. And also, the present is not an indication of the future. If the global temperature rises by 1.5, the kind of devastation which will be caused, can we now say that climate change will not be responsible for violence? So past study does not necessarily tell us that the scale of environmental change which will take place as a result of climate change might actually lead to a lot of violence as well.
I will say this. I am neither an oracle about the future, nor am I a climate scientist. And so I'm an expert in political violence. And I can tell you what political violence is triggered by and what it looks like and its patterns and what it's influenced by and its at least very short-term future. I can tell you that. And I can tell you with absolute confidence that it's not related to the weather, except for strategies in South Sudan. And that is really how I would end it. And of course, I agree with you, there are tensions and there is an unknowable future. You're right. But using evidence now to say, look what it's going to be like in the future when it's going to be totally different is, I think, a real misstep in research. And I think we should call it as we see it on that.
before we close the lecture, I just would like to draw your attention to some upcoming events here at the school, which I think will be of interest. At the same time next week, we have Professor Gunnar Sorbo from the Mikkelsen Institute in Norway talking on food security and conflict, narratives and interventions. And as part of the same series, but at a different time, the following Monday, 22nd of May at 12:30 here in this room, we have David Jensen, who is head of the Environmental Cooperation for Peacebuilding Initiative at the UN Environment Programme. And he will talk with the title, Environment, Conflict and Peacebuilding, a Personal Journey of Change Within the UN. And on a completely different note, this coming Wednesday, we have Professor Molly Crockett, who is Professor of Experimental Psychology here at Oxford, talking on moral outrage in the digital age. So just 3 of our upcoming events. And I would like to close by thanking Clionadh very much for giving us a fascinating set of challenges to some widely held assumptions and a really thought-provoking talk. Thank you.